שלום לכולם, אנחנו נקיים את הפאנל הזה היום באנגלית, אבל אני רוצה להזמין את כולכם גם לשאול שאלות, אם יש מישהו שירים את היד. יש לנו כאן פאנל מאוד מרתק. We have a very exciting panel today. We want to get started, and I'd like to get started by introducing the people here. So on my right is Itamar Amichai. He's an investment team member of Forceon RZ Capital. Forceon RZ is the venture capital arm of the global Forceon group of companies with offices in China, India, US, and Israel. They just opened. We're going to talk about it. Forceon RZ is an investment across technology sectors in early stage companies. Very exciting. We have Holo Zhang. She's the founder and CEO of TechCode Israel, the first Chinese accelerator in Israel. As part of TechCode Global Network, TechCode Israel serves as a bridge between Chinese market and Israeli innovation. And we have Chaim Martin, recently finished his term as the head of the Economic Commission in the Embassy of Israel in Beijing. Since returning to Israel, he has founded Yagata Trade and Yagata Capital, and he's working closely with a number of Chinese investors, assisting them to invest in the Israeli industry. And Itamar is a little bit MIA right now. He's the CTO and co-founder of VisualLead that operates in China and eventually sold to Alibaba. Now Itamar is the director in Alibaba DAMO Israel Lab. So these are our co-panelists. Thank you very much for being here today. You have the microphones, and we want to start by talking a little bit about what it is that the Chinese investors are looking in Israel. From your perspective, I'm just going to say that according to IVC Research Center, the Chinese investors were directly involved in 2018 in about 12% of all local rounds for startups investment, which is an increase of all their investment that they had in the last 3 years, was about 9%. In total, the numbers of Chinese direct investment in Israel is about $1.5 billion, and this does not include all the Chinese investment that are coming through VCs and other funds in Israel. So we're talking about large amount of money and large amount of Chinese investors who are actively looking and seeking investments in Israel. And we want to tap into it. I know that there's a lot of Israeli companies who are looking to work with the Chinese investments. And in today's panel, we're going to explore what's the state of the Chinese investment in Israel market and provide some best practices for those who are actively seeking. Itamar? And with that in mind, we have 4 panelists from different companies and organizations who are either facilitating investments or are investing now. And to start the discussion, I would like to ask each and every one of you, in your perspective, what kind of type of companies is mostly common to Chinese investors? What are they looking for? And try to answer with your own perspectives.
Good morning. So I'll start. I'd focus on 2 points I'd say points that have changed over the last few years. When I got to China for the first time 5 years ago, it was the whole trend of Chinese investors looking into Israel just was starting off, or starting to, there's been investments for a long time, but it started increasing significantly. And I'd say that there's 2 points that have changed over the span of these 5 years. One is, back in the day, a lot of the investments were financial. A Chinese investor was looking where to put his money to maybe, he looked in the VC ecosystem, in the startup ecosystem. China was less developed, so he went to places like the US and he went to places like Israel. And the investment was financial. He wanted to know that he's getting a return, or that he has a chance of getting a good return. He's investing either in a VC or directly in an early stage company. Over the years, for many reasons, also from guidance from the Chinese government, and also because of the nature of the Chinese investors, the investments started focusing in more strategic investments. I want a company that is complementary to my company in China. I want some sort of investment where I will be a long-term partner and gain from it in the future. So that's one point that I think is very important, because as was mentioned here before, when you understand the agenda, the chance of making a deal is much, much higher. The second point I would focus on is also the industry. It used to be that investors were investing in China for infrastructure or for manufacturing, and when they wanted tech, they invested outside of China. Today, the tech ecosystem in China is very, very impressive. It is growing rapidly, and as was mentioned before about patents, it's a big part. So now, Israeli startups or startups abroad are competing with very good local technologies in China, and therefore the competition is much, much stronger. And the uniqueness of the startups that Chinese investors are looking for abroad has to be a lot more unique, and the Israeli startups or foreign startups need to make sure that when they are presenting to Chinese investors, they know exactly what else is there in the Chinese market.
So first of all, thank you, Zev. It's a pleasure to be here and participate in this panel. So as you mentioned in the introduction, Forceon RZ Capital is the venture capital arm of the Global Forceon Group of companies. And the Israeli office is managed by Dani Adar. I joined him together with Yuval Dimnik on June 2019 to establish the presence of the fund here in Israel. And in that respect, we operate as a regular venture capital that's looking for financial returns. Our investment strategy is to look very widely across all sectors at all stages. So from our perspective, I can't really say that there is a common sector that we are looking at, and that is because essentially, like any other VC, we're looking to invest in a good business with strong fundamentals, good teams that can eventually become a leader in their market. And I think that this is something which is very common to every other investor, whether it is from the United States, China, or Israel. I can say that based on the global strategy of the fund, we are focused on companies that are developing high technologies and can substantiate a technology moat around their products and services. And as probably all of you know, Israel is a great place to find such companies, and this is exactly why the fund is here. So now we are mainly looking at B2B software in the domains of industrial automation, robotics, digital health, financial technologies, DevOps, and more.
Great, thank you. Holo, you want to? Oh, you got it.
Hello? Yeah. You hear me? Cool. Yeah. Hi. First of all, thank you, Zev. It's not the first time that we meet on panel. And it's such a pleasure to be here. So in the past 4 to 5 years, Telco Israel has been bridging China and the Israeli market. And we do see that the investment coming in, and sometimes more, sometimes less, and people always ask why it's more, why it's less, and why this one succeed, why this one not. And so I do actually relate a lot of the points that Haim just made. I understand you've been in China for quite a while, and I want to maybe go a little bit further on a few points. The first one is that I think more than often we look at investment as a very business term. But in China, it is and it's not. First of all, when we talk about which track we are taking, which track the investors are looking at, more than often, it goes exactly 100% with the government agenda. And why is that? I have to give you one example. We all know a lot of VCs. In China, there are so many VCs, and if you look at the top 100, and they all have the international background, they have probably hired people from US, Israel, and the whole thing looks very business-oriented. However, if you look at the LP behind them, more than 50% of the money, or maybe even more, comes from state-owned or national entity. So let's just think about how the money, where the source of the money. And that's why this is point one, that how we should look at the national agenda to understand why the investor make one deal or not. And second is that we often say, the policy will take time to influence the investor's decision. Well, I would say that yes, it takes time. Sometimes it takes 3 to 5 years. But there are also opportunities that if you stand a little bit closer, you will see it happens much faster than you thought. I'll take one of the provinces in the north. I can't name them, unfortunately, as an example. The policy basically stopped companies from making pollution. And this is a very, very hardcore policy. And there's a certain number that just can't go beyond. And as a result, hundreds of people have to change their business in a very short time, maybe in 1 year. And what do we have now? Hundreds of people who has money with no projects and all the infrastructures and all the experience of managing multi-million-dollar companies. So this kind of opportunities, they do come within the big frame of the frame of the big agenda. So this is the second thing. And the third thing that I want to say is about when it goes cross-border, because this one happens in China. You may say that, okay, they will look for projects, maybe not in Israel. So let's talk about another example. Last year, as we all know, there was a lot of acquisition in the US by Chinese investors in medical device industry. And we think that it's because the technology, the product is really good and the Chinese market really need it. Yes, but why now? Actually, in the past 4 years, the purchase, the investment increased 7 times. 7 times in 4 years. It's mostly because medical device industry is the #1 focus in the new plan, China 2025. And this is why everybody understands there's a huge trend and we need to be part of it. So I just want to give a few points so you understand why the point Hai made is very important. Is that and the investment is there, and by the source of the money, and the big trend, and even the actual practice are all related to how we understand the big agenda.
Yeah. So stay in tune with the government. That's great. Itamar, you want to take it from there?
Hey, Zev, first of all, thank you for calling me here. It's an honor to be here. So I think that one of the questions you asked is what do the Chinese investors are looking for? And I think you got the answer, it's complicated, right? And I think it's a good opportunity to say that maybe you missed the point. It's a bit, we shouldn't generalize what the Chinese investor looking on. And you hear many answer that we need to look on the sector, we need to look on the background and things like that. So I think we need to be careful with the generalization. Having said that, if I must answer, I think maybe there are 3 points that we can try to generalize for all the Chinese investors. First, I think they're looking for companies with mature technology. I think we see less investment, for example, in seed companies. I think where Chinese investors are looking for proven or close to proven business model. And the last thing, I think they appreciate go to China plan. Okay, so it's again, be careful with generalizing, but I think that's 3 points to look on.
Right. I think in general we're going to generalize a lot when we're talking about China, but let's keep it up and let's stay with you, Itamar. So you have a very unique perspective. So you were a co-founder and the CTO of Visual Lead. I don't know, you weren't in the hall, but you were mentioned before. And now you're working with Alibaba here in Israel, which is obviously, I don't need to tell everybody who is Alibaba. So you know that you were a VC, you were a startup looking for investment, and you took investment from a Chinese company, a very big one, and now you're working in that company. So maybe from your perspective, maybe you can tell us how does it like to go on? Let's go into the Visual Lead perspective. How does it feel to go on investment with the Chinese investors, from the due diligence to closing? What's the process? How does it differ from Western investors, if any?
Yeah, thank you. So I think in the same fashion or flavor what I said before, I'll answer that with two aspects. So first of all, I think it's a good question. I've been asked about it a lot. I mean, many people come, what do you think about penetrating to China? How do you get the Chinese money, etc. And I think it's so confusing. As Amir mentioned before, it's like if you just try to understand just a bit, you don't get much. You need to really change and learn a lot to really understand what you need to do different. So my first thing to suggest is that I believe that the core business principles are the same. The core principles. So you need to have a good technology, you need to have a good product, you need to have a plan, etc. You need to have a good valuable proposition. If you have that, then other things should go fine, of course. And then the other aspect is that there's a lot of differences, and it's hard to say them at once. So I'll try to maybe point two. One is I think that there's also Amir mentioned there's the thing of trust, and part of creating trust, you've been asked sometimes things that you weren't being used to ask by the Western investors. For example, the amount of code that you might be asked to share in order to pass the due diligence might be higher. And my suggestion is to create this trust step by step and asking for trust for the other side as well. Because if you try to avoid giving this things that you've been asked to, you might ruin the option to create such trust. But you want to see the other side giving the trust as well. So for example, ask for something in return, sign this contract, or let's move to proof of concept where I actually see some of the money or things like that. You know what, I'll stop here because I think there are already a few. Okay,
but that was interesting because when we were talking backstage, you were talking a lot about that there is a need of different business tactics when you're working with the investor, and maybe we can touch upon that as well. But maybe we can move to Yotam. And Yotam, you were talking about Forceon. We all know about Forceon. I mean, it's the second biggest investment conglomerate in China, one of the biggest in the world. It had a few acquisitions in Israel. We know about Ava, El Malaysia, and then in February, was it, or in the beginning of this year, they have decided to open up an office in Israel. So maybe you can tell us more about the decision. Maybe also about your investment perspective. You talked about it a little bit before, or what kind of value do you bring for Israeli companies? There's a lot of VCs around here. What can you bring them in terms of the potential fit to the Chinese market, etc.?
Great. So you mentioned the Ava and Al Malaysia acquisitions, and it's important to emphasize that those acquisitions were done by Forceon Pharma, and are not related to Forceon RZ Capital, which act as an individual investment fund. As I mentioned earlier, we are a financial player looking for financial returns. However, we have a very significant advantage of being supported by a huge conglomerate like Forceon and affiliated to. And so we do examine the potential synergies of the companies that we look to invest in with the existing companies inside within the Forceon group of companies. Also, we look how we can harness the global resources of Forceon in order to help those companies. More than that, we have in the fund people that are designated to help the companies with relevant business connections following the investment. Also, we are examining potential fit to the Chinese market and how we can help those companies to get into the Chinese market. However, it's not a must because, as I mentioned, we are a financial player and we can invest in a company even if it's not a fit to the Chinese market. So it really depends on the type of the company and the relevant use case.
Yeah. So even though that you are not a typical CVC, or basically a financial investor, you do have those capabilities and you do have all the resources that Forceon can give you with the network and the ability of
yes, definitely.
Reaching out the portfolio. I think that's a great advantage. Hello, you've one of the first Chinese incubators / open innovation / connectors, I would say, because you're doing so many things. that established actually a presence in Israel. So you weren't just coming with a delegation and all those, doing the MOUs. You actually, had a foot on the ground. And you're a Chinese living in Israel for how long now? You're living in Israel for how long now? It seems like you're living here for a decade. No?
It's my 6th year.
6th year?
Yes.
All right, so your Hebrew is good. Next year we're doing it in Hebrew.
Good.
Great. Maybe we can hear a little bit of your insights about what is it like from your perspective for an Israeli startup who would like to get engaged with the Chinese investors, whether it's government or others.
Right. So things to talk about Hebrew, I'm just saying I'm going to go tachlis. So probably some of the points probably you'll feel like it's a bit too blunt. And the first one is I think a lot of people, that's a lot of Israeli entrepreneurs, lose their chutzpah completely when it comes to Chinese market. Why am I saying it? Chinese investors are not so scary. It's just like Itamar mentioned. They always ask questions. They ask for data they don't want to give, but you don't have to say no. Everything you need, exactly like I said, just ask for something in return. They are willing to pay. They are willing to step forward, but they will not back off from the information they want. Actually, what I think is that we need to be more aggressive when it goes to Chinese market. Because in our past 4 years opening TechCode, the most successful case is not even a very well-established company. It's a company that has 2 engineers, very experienced, going to China for the first time and decided, yes, I'm going to create a company tomorrow because I just realized how much potential I have. And in that trip, they met a Chinese investor. They get an angel investment. Their success come in the next 2 years, and currently, 70% of the products are going to Chinese market, and they have 3 offices in China and 12 employees, including engineers. This is a typical case that is a little bit extreme, maybe not so typical, but what I want to say is that there are people who already got the courage to step a little bit further. And this is my first point. And let's regain the chutzpah. And the second is that I want to echo with what they have said. We do everything. Why we do everything? Because this is a typical Chinese company, and this is our way of survival. It's because the ecosystem is so complicated. They have so many different opportunities that we cannot ignore any part because they all have correlation. And here I want to point something that here we sit, we know Forceon, we know Alibaba, but how many companies are there in China that can actually be able to invest in Israel? Let me give you a number. All the listed companies in China, there are 17,000. 17,000, but how many do we know? And the one that has a market value over 100 billion is only a very slim layer, 100 billion RMB, I'm sorry, RMB. It's very slim, but there are probably 100 of them. But 16,900 companies, we probably don't know. And among those 16,900, there are companies who purchased 3 European factories this year. And there are also companies that has only 5 factories in China, but they are willing to invest $1 million in a UK research center. So my point is that there is an invisible majority that we don't see, just because there's a knowledge gap. I think it's a big loss. That's why I also want to point out that what we want to do is not just to pass it, point by point. We have a meeting today. I tell you 5 people. We have a meeting tomorrow. I send you an email about 1 contact. No, we are actually trying to put together a platform called TechBook that we handpick 100 to 1,000 requests every year from China, and also with their contact information and everything, so you can talk to them directly. And right now, it's already online in China, and very soon we're going to launch it in Israel. Right. And so I hope that you will be able to see the flyer on your table, and my colleague from headquarters will also give a keynote afterwards to elaborate.
Sure. So you're saying that there's 1,700 companies, 17,000 companies that we still haven't met. Even though that, judging by the amount of delegations from China, it feels that all of them were here by now, but we still have time with that. Chaim, let me get back to you. So you've just, your previous role was you were the commercial counselor in Beijing. You were there for 4.5 years, and now you shifted from government to private sector. So I'm going to wish you good luck. But as a person that was in the government and dealing with promoting investment and helping Israeli companies to enter the Chinese market, you've seen so many companies and you've dealt with so many companies. Maybe you can tell us, what are the main challenges that Israeli companies are facing in general, but also particular to investment? And if there's any regulations or restrictions that we should be aware of?
Yeah, so I think when it comes to investments, actually the challenge is always from both sides. If the Israeli side has a challenge, the investor has a challenge. It's in the relationship. And I think we discuss a lot of times how to make the deal, but the really important part of the investment is after you sign the deal, and now you have to run this relationship long term. So if an investor is investing in a specific technology, that usually a company that needs investment is a company that is in some sort of stage of development. And so the development has to be according to the investor's agenda, right? So often the investors, as was mentioned before, want to see the China angle. What could we do with this technology in China? But the Israeli company has to remember that, and the Chinese investor has to remember and to make sure that his agenda is always heard, because the development is different if you're looking at the American market or the European market, or if you're looking at the Chinese market. And it's different on many levels. It's different in the regulation aspect. Well, we could touch that very briefly because it's a big topic. But if I'm developing a specific medical device, so I want to start at a very early stage to do my clinical trials in China at the same time that I'm doing it in other countries. If you don't do that, by the time you want to enter the Chinese market, you'll be far behind and you'll have to start now a new 3-year process. So the Chinese investor has to make sure that the Israeli company has the China angle always in mind. Now, it's very hard to do because these are developers, early stage, and even if not, startups, as you guys know, are packed with a million things on their mind, and they just need to prove the concept, and they don't necessarily have the mindfulness to say, okay, I also need to prove the concept in the States and also in Europe and also in China. They'll do what is closest to them. So that's something in the relationship. And different investors found a solution in different ways. Some investors make sure to be here in Israel and have someone who's visiting the company twice a month, okay? But not every investor could do that. So some take a local person who understands China and they say, okay, you be our representative and be part of the team. So you can always bring the China angle. But that is very, very important because otherwise the investment in the investor's eyes was not a successful investment, and that's a problem for the Israeli company coming. And this is relevant to many types of regulation. It could be in medical, as we mentioned. It could be anything in the software business today, and post the cybersecurity law in China. Anything in software needs to have all kind of adapting for the Chinese market, whether it's servers or where the software sits, etc. It could be in almost any sector. There will be some regulation in China that you have to fit it in, but the mindfulness of the company in Israel has to be focused on that, and that's part of the long-term relationship. Furthermore, usually investors at some stage, if they're happy and they're feeling that the company's growing, will look to invest more in a later stage, and that's very important.
Right. Thank you. Itamar, when you were in Visually, you were focused, you were targeting basically the Chinese market in a sense. You took a strategic decision that this is your market and you go to it. And when we were talking, you mentioned a lot that China should be a strategic decision, especially if we're in startup where you have limited resources and time spent, etc. We were also talking about the information gap, or that is a problematic for Israeli companies in general, whether you're a startup or even a more mature company. Maybe you can relate to that. I mean, from your experience, how can an Israeli company bridge those kind of aspects? What do they need to come a little bit more prepared to that market?
Okay, so thanks for. I think we have some mutual advice and some that do not, fall along together. And I think it's each one of you to decide what fits for its own startup. So I do agree, for example, that once you decide to go into China, you need to be very aggressive, or maybe I can say assertive, and because it's a tough market, and you need to be very serious about it. Now, when you say that, it means that you need to open, like Amir said as well, to get localized. You need to have a local partner, perhaps even someone in the management of the local office that you open there that is Chinese, in order to help with closing the gap. And one other thing that also Chaim said, I think that if you can think about China in advance and start learning it and understanding which region do you want to go. Is it Jiangning, or is it Shanghai, or Beijing, or Hangzhou, or etc. It does matter, and to some extent, and eventually you also need to understand that it will be hard to close the entire information gap, and you need to operate accordingly. So assertive or aggressive is one way. Having a very strong advantage in technology or product or approved business model, etc. And this I would like to relate to. You asked kind of do's and don'ts or something like that, Holo. So here I might be saying something different than was said before. Example given before. I think that if you're a seed stage, etc., do not go there. And it's again, I'm generalizing here. And if you are already, got your business model, etc., and you have a good amount of money to invest, then you should go into China. Of course, if it fits your product and thinking, because it's a huge opportunity and it's growing and etc. And that's and if you go there with enough money and knowing what you need to know, then it's easier for you to close the gap of information.
Well, let's continue with that and ask everybody here to give us your 2 cents about the do's and don'ts in China for Israeli companies.
Thank you. So first of all, I do relate to that. In general, the Chinese market always prefer that you have success somewhere else. Then we just repeat this. Copy this. But at the same time, I do want to point out that the decision is in your own hands. And the most important is to be able to be exposed to all the information as much as you can. Why am I saying that? Because this is a market that doesn't wait for anyone. There are many times we already have a product here, we think it's superb. And then we realize there's something similar in the other side of the world that already selling on the market. It happens all the time. That's why I want to mention a little bit about how to approach those investors, because sometimes they will look at how mature you are, but they will also look at how connected you are to the market, regardless of the maturity of the product. If you have a partner to co-develop the product in China together with you, even if your product is not yet there, it's just piloting, they will still be very interested. Actually, the same thing happens when they invest in Chinese product. They will also look at Chinese products that are working with overseas, even if they are not even selling there. So with this mentality in mind, I still want to emphasize how we expose ourselves and how we get ourselves exposed to information. And there are so many ways. So again, I'm not really selling the product yet, but I do think that we need to do all the market research before we approach any investor to actually know who are our competitors in China, who are our potential partners. And only with this kind of knowledge already fulfilled, the gap already fulfilled, the investor will really feel that you are serious about them, and they will want to even start a conversation with you. That is very important, I think. Thank you.
So I love the idea of telling Israelis to be more aggressive and more chutzpah. I never heard that in my life. But it is true when it comes to trying to understand the agenda of whoever's sitting in front of you. What happens is some Israelis come to a meeting and they just, give a monologue of like, I don't know, half an hour, and then no one bothered them and everyone was nodding with their heads, so they're so excited. They come out of the meeting and they think that now that was a great meeting. So I would say use the chutzpah in making sure you understand everything. And ask all the questions that you need and make sure to really understand the other side. But at the same time, you have to try always listening, okay? What is the other side interested in? It'll also help you to create the deal, and it will also help you to deal with whatever is coming. And this is true also when you're dealing with the technical barriers, whether it's regulation or anything else. Sometimes you'll get answers like, that's how it is in China, it's different, and you don't really understand. If you don't understand, ask again. And if you don't understand again, ask again or ask someone who knows. Because if you don't understand and you just accept an answer of that's how it is, later on, you'll be sorry about it. So that is very, very important. I would say use the chutzpah in order to understand, but at the same time, make sure you're always listening to the other side to understand what they're trying to get out of the deal. And that way, you could serve them better and create a better long-term relationship.
Yotam, before you get the do's and don'ts, I also want to refer if you guys are a financial investor, and we were talking about whether an early stage startup could make it in China, something that you would be looking into invest in.
Yeah. So regarding early stage investments, we look from all stages, from early stage to growth. And I think it really depends on the type of the company. It really depends about the business model, about the technology. So I wouldn't necessarily say that an early stage startup should not aim for the Chinese market. About the do's and don'ts. So as a VC, I can't say that. I mean, there is something specifically that you do or don't. Just it's the same with every other investor. If I need to point a specific thing, is be practical. I mean, for example, I was once in a conference when an American investor said that Israeli startups have a problem. They don't know how to sell the dream. And so if you're going to Chinese investor, from my perspective, don't try to sell the dream. Be practical. Show what you're capable of, show how you go fast to the market, show why your technology is going to win, and this is basically about it, be practical.
Great, that's actually a great point. We are running out of time, and I'd like to thank all of you. I think that what we've learned today, first of all, from people here who are dealing with China from different perspectives, both from tech giants to startups to incubators and connectors, and obviously with the government, is that there's not one angle here, but I think we can all agree that you have to come prepared to the Chinese market, and you have to come with a bandwidth, be ready for a journey, I would say. I'd like to thank you very much for your time, and you're all here, so I think that a lot of people would love to connect with you and to get your cards, and thank you very much. Thank you. So if there's no any questions, I think we're going to ask Ariel to come. Thank you very much.